Welcome to the fourth video in the Our Faith, Our Vote Issue Education video series. The United Church of Christ's Our Faith, Our Vote campaign is designed to equip the faith community for nonpartisan engagement in elections through voter registration, issue education, and voter mobilization and empowerment. We hope you'll use this video to get informed about the issues at stake in the elections, issues that our faith calls us to address. In this video, we will discuss the topic of human rights, with the help of our international policy advocate, Reverend Michael Neuroth, and a panel of faith leaders well informed in this issue area. Mike, can you start us off and introduce our panelists, please?
Thank you, Jesse. I'll be happy to. First off, thank you to those of you tuning into this webinar as part of our Faith, Our Vote campaign. And special thanks to my colleagues here who are taking time out of their day to join us. I'll actually be introducing each of them before they speak, but I wanted to open up with a bit of an introduction as we get started. In 2018, the world marked the 70th anniversary of the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. That year was also the same year that the World Council of Churches was founded. And indeed, the ecumenical movement's history and work for human rights and protection of those rights through international law have been intertwined throughout our history. The United Church of Christ has been part of that work from the beginning, based on our call to love our neighbor and our belief that each person is made in the image of God. We have been at the forefront of efforts to affirm the rights of women, children, LGBTQ siblings, people with disabilities, indigenous people, and people of all races and nationalities. Today, we advocate regularly on any number of issues, including human trafficking, religious freedom, and the rights of global partners around the world. Today, we're going to hear from some of our advocacy partners and our global ministry staff on some of the human rights issues that we are most concerned about and which the upcoming November election will play a critical role in. Focus today on Colombia, Palestine, Israel, and the Philippines. And then we'll also hear from Rebekah Choate on what some of the other issues that our global partners are currently engaged with. Let me begin by introducing my good colleague, Lisa Haugaard, longtime partner of the United Church of Christ on issues of Latin American policy. Lisa is the co-director of the Latin America Working Group and has spearheaded advocacy on human rights and peace issues in Latin America for over 2 decades. She directs advocacy on Colombia, Central America, development, and military aid and policy, and coordinates coalition campaigns with the US and Latin American partners. She's testified multiple times before Congress and participated in international human rights verification missions to the region. Lisa holds a BA from Swarthmore, a master's in Latin American Studies from New York University, and was a Fulbright Scholar in Central America. Lisa, Latin America is now one of the epicenters of the COVID-19 pandemic. This moment overlaps with the critical phases of the implementation of the historic peace agreement with Colombia, with one of the last surviving guerrilla organizations in the hemisphere. Can you give us a sense of what's happening in Colombia related to human rights and what the top 1 to 2 concerns are at this time?
Thank you, Mike. The major concern that we have and our Colombian partners have is the very weak implementation of the 2016 peace accords in Colombia. Now, these peace accords in 2016 were a historic first in which the guerrillas, FARC guerrillas, and the Colombian government signed a peace deal to end decades of brutal conflict in which 260,000 people were killed and more than 8 million people were internally displaced. I can't even begin to tell you all the kind of hope that this peace agreement engendered in the victims of the conflict across Colombia. But shortly after that, Colombians were divided on peace, elected a president who was not in support of the peace accords. And while he has implemented the peace accords, he has done so without a lot of enthusiasm. And that has really put in danger Many of the human rights defenders and social leaders in Colombia, some 500 of whom have been killed since the peace accords were signed. At the same time, all over Colombia, victims of the conflict took the peace accords at their word and began organizing in support of peace and building peace on the ground and nationally. Victims offered heart-wrenching testimony in front of the Truth Commission about the terror that they had experienced and who was responsible, and did the same in front of the transitional justice courts, which is a dangerous thing to do. They joined in building local development plans that were envisioned in the peace accords. They convinced their communities to eradicate coca, again, which was part of the peace accords. They marched for peace, and they organized for peace. And Protestant churches in a group coalition called DPAS are an important part of this effort. But the slow implementation of the peace accord left people in danger. Illegal armed groups that still existed poured back into the areas of the conflict from which the FARC guerrillas had withdrawn, and the civilian part of the Colombian state did not really enter in strength in order to be able to put something else in its place. What is the United States doing about this right now? Well, you have to understand first that the United States was part of the war. It was part of the war effort, which was very long and had many human rights violations. But fortunately, the United States was also part of the peace and really pushed for the peace negotiations to go forward. And still, we see the U.S. Embassy and U.S. aid doing a lot to support peace accord implementation. But at the sort of highest level of U.S. policy right now, we don't see as strong a support for peace, and what we see is an emphasis on coca eradication without really helping farmers put something else in its place, possible return to the aerial spraying program, which is very damaging for human health and the environment, and then sort of thinking of Colombia just as how useful it is regarding Venezuela next door. So we need a renewal of support for peace accords right now, and that would really help the people who are getting, who are once more in danger of losing their lives for working for peace.
Thank you for that. You've touched a bit on kind of how U.S. foreign policy is impacting those peace accords in helping their implementation or not implementation. Is there anything else you would like to add to that? And maybe I'll combine that with the question of how do you see, our webinar today is in the context of encouraging folks to be engaged in our Faith, Our Vote campaign work this fall. How do you see the elections impacting these issues in a nonpartisan way? Mm-hmm. And maybe what do you see as your hope for U.S. foreign policy in the future?
Yeah, I would like to mention there's really a lot that people can do to encourage U.S. policy that supports peace and human rights in Colombia. For example, just recently, 94 members of Congress sent a letter to the to the State Department, urging us focus on peace and support for human rights defenders. And I imagine many members of the UCC network helped in making that happen. So I would really urge people to do those kinds of actions. They can really make a difference. If you're in town halls talking to candidates about issues, raise those kinds of issues about the importance of a foreign policy towards Colombia or elsewhere that really supports peace and human rights. Those foreign policy issues don't get raised all that often, as I'm sure my colleagues here will also agree with. And when your member does something good, your member of Congress does something good, thank them and remember, who did that. Yeah, so there's actually a lot you can do and engage on these issues. And I just also say that if you want to get on our list of alerts on Colombia policy and other Latin America issues, you can go to our website at lawg.org.
Great, well, thank you for that. Well, I know there's much more to be said on this topic, and but I do encourage folks to join the Latin America Working Group list, where you can sign up for the general alerts as well as specific campaign alerts on any number of contexts, Colombia, Cuba, and others. So I encourage folks to do that. I'll now maybe turn to my colleague, Kyle Cristofalo. Kyle is the Senior Director of Advocacy and Government Relations at Churches for Middle East Peace. Kyle holds a BA in Peace and Conflict Studies from Messiah College, as well as a Master's of Divinity from Emory University's Candor School of Theology. After graduating from college, Kyle spent 10 months serving with Mennonite Central Committee in Bethlehem, Palestine, where he was seconded to the work at Bethlehem Bible College. Kyle has worked at the Friends Committee on National Legislation and for the Presbyterian Church, where he has helped coordinate lobbying work on Middle East policy. Kyle, you know that the United Church of Christ has a deep concern for issues of Palestine and Israel. It has been one of the denominations, for example, that is concerned with the treatment of youth in Israeli military prison. Can you speak briefly to that issue as well as to other top concerns that CMEP has related to human rights in the context of Israel-Palestine at this time?
Thank you, Mike. Yes, I'm happy to, and we've been grateful to have the partnership of the United Church of Christ and Disciple of Christ as a really integral member of CMEP. I'll start maybe then with the issue of child detention and then move on to some of the other pressing concerns regarding human rights that we're seeing in Israel-Palestine at the moment. As Mike noted, the issue of the mistreatment of Palestinian children in Israeli military detention has been a core concern for the UCC and several other faith groups for a while now. This practice, what happens in the West Bank is that if a Palestinian minor, generally between the ages of 12 and 17, though some even younger have been put through this system, are accused of any wrongdoing, no matter the scope, they go through a military detention. There is no juvenile justice system for Palestinian youth within the West Bank. And so it's been well documented in US Department of State, human rights reports by Israeli and Palestinian human rights organizations, as well as international human rights groups, the mistreatment that Palestinian youth endured in this process. So sometimes they're taken from their home in the middle of the night. Their parents might not know what's happening, where they're taken. They're often taken outside of the West Bank into Israel proper. And the parents then can't get to them even if they knew where they were. There's been instances of physical abuse against the children. Oftentimes they end up signing confessions of guilt in Hebrew, which is a language they obviously don't read or understand, but they're told if they sign this, then they can speak to a lawyer, or they can have food, or they can, talk to their parents. So generally, annually, there's 500 to 700 Palestinian youth that are under Israeli military detention. Some of them are detained even within solitary confinement. So Congresswoman Betty McCollum from the Twin Cities area has introduced legislation on this issue. I would encourage you to look it up if you are not familiar with it. HR 2407, Churches for Middle East Peace is a strong supporter, as well as the UCC and Disciples of Christ. But this legislation would ensure that no US funds that go to Israel could be used for these practices, the practices that I've mentioned of both the physical and the emotional mistreatment of Palestinian youth. But it would also authorize the appropriation of $19 million annually that would go to organizations that are investigating these practices, but also working to provide psychosocial support for children when they come out of the military detention system. As you can imagine, many are quite traumatized and might drop out of school or just not really know how to interact with their family anymore or with their friends. And so there are organizations that help provide them with psychosocial support. So that, again, is HR 2407, and we have materials on that on our website, cmep.org, and I know that the UCC does as well, so I would encourage you to look that up. Has over 20 co-sponsors now, but it would be great to have more before the end of this Congress. The other issue that's really concerning for us at the moment related to human rights is the issue of annexation. Some of you might have heard and be following that. The Israeli government is considering whether it will formally annex land in the occupied West Bank. It's still uncertain how much they might, but mostly within Area C of the West Bank, could be up to 30% of the Area C of the West Bank. This would mean that Israelis who live within this territory in settlements that are illegal under international law, that would be considered formally part of Israel. However, the Palestinians that reside in that area, this is a resource-rich area of the West Bank where the Palestinian population lives, would likely not be granted citizenship. And if they might actually even be moved from their homes to another part of the West Bank that would remain under Palestinian control. So this is troubling. We've seen over the past several decades what's often referred to as creeping annexation, where we've seen settlement expansion within the West Bank. We've seen displacement of Palestinian homes, of Palestinian people, as well as the destruction of homes and some of their other structures within their communities. So this would be, though, it would move from that creeping de facto to de jure. It would be legal and formally recognized by Israel. The US and Israel are working on a map to determine what the land is. So some of the confusion right now is over, again, how much of the territory might be annexed. Any of the annexation we would view as detrimental to Palestinian human rights. Palestinians have really said that and made clear that it's a violation of their human rights. It would take them away from their land and really make it quite challenging for there to be a future Palestinian state. And this is also something that's been mentioned by a lot of the Christian churches in the Holy Land and in the West Bank. All of the 13 heads of the churches and patriarchs in Jerusalem have released a joint statement against annexation. There have been a number of Christian pastors in the West Bank that have really pleaded specifically to the Christian community in the US to show the harm that this move would do. And I think especially in light of COVID, when we're seeing a global pandemic, it's really disheartening that not only do Palestinians have to worry about possibly coming down with COVID and worrying about their family and their livelihoods, but the possibility of annexation as well. And so that's been on the top of our mind and the minds of a lot of other organizations at this moment.
Thank you for that summary, Kyle. It's a lot
Yes. Yeah.
packed in there. As Lisa said, the conflict in Colombia, the U.S. is part of that. And I think likewise, we see just how intertwined U.S. foreign policy is in this conflict in Palestine, Israel. Could you speak a bit more to how U.S. policy relates, and maybe as well how you see the November elections possibly impacting that policy, and what hopes you have for U.S. policy going forward?
Happy to. Well, of course, as I think even for folks who don't follow Israel-Palestine very closely know, the conflict is usually at the top of a president's agenda, right? Wanting to be the one to deliver the peace agreement. And it's also of concern for a lot of members of Congress, even those that are not particularly on the Foreign Relations or Foreign Affairs Committee. So it does play a big part in U.S. Foreign policy for sure. When we think about some of the actions that have taken place over the past 3 years, we have seen a cut in humanitarian assistance to the West Bank and Gaza. So that's been troubling for us from the U.S. foreign policy perspective. We've been encouraging members of Congress who have opposed that decision to speak up to make sure that these funds can be allocated. Traditionally, the U.S. has been quite a strong supporter of humanitarian and economic assistance to the region. Upwards of $225 million annually as part of the appropriations process that goes directly to humanitarian and economic agencies in the West Bank and Gaza that are run by international NGOs. So we've cut that funding, which has been unfortunate, which really then impacts the ability of the Palestinians, the most vulnerable Palestinians, to have access to jobs and security and medical and educational services. We've also cut funding to UNRWA, which is the UN agency that provides emergency food relief, medical, jobs, and education to the 5 million plus Palestinian refugees that are not just in the West Bank and Gaza, but also Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria. So that's been disheartening for us as far as U.S. foreign policy, I think, not playing the role that it could. We are encouraged that there are members of Congress that, it has traditionally been bipartisan support for the principles of humanitarian assistance, the belief that it should not be politicized. So, there continue to be ways that we've been engaging, both the administration and members of Congress, to push for this aid to move forward. We were pleased that the administration did put forward some $75 million in emergency COVID relief to the West Bank when the COVID pandemic began. So that was something that we thought was a good step, but needed more. I think when it gets to the November elections, what is likely to be the biggest shift, if there is a change in leadership, is that our current U.S. foreign policy related to Israel-Palestine has been anchored in the Trump administration's Peace to Prosperity proposal. The economic portion of that proposal came out about a year ago, and the political part earlier this year in January. And if there is a change, then obviously the Biden administration would not use that as a framework moving forward. And so a lot of Congress, it's still sort of in a holding pattern, trying to see what's going to happen. If there's a new administration, Vice President Biden has indicated he would, for example, want to resume humanitarian assistance to the region, which would be good. But again, we've seen some the start of that even now with the current administration. So we're really pushing for, again, regardless of who is in power, we think something like humanitarian assistance is critical. It really connects with human rights concerns, we feel. If you're not able to have access to medical care or education or emergency economic support in times of distress, then you're not able to obviously live the life that you deserve to be able to live, and you can't care for your family and create the society that will help result in justice and peace for all in Israel and Palestine. So we do hope that, again, we see, regardless of who is in the White House come January 2021, that we'll move toward policies that will help really bring back some of the dignity to both Israelis and Palestinians.
Thank you for that. And finally, in addition to encouraging folks to vote their values on these issues and vote for candidates that take seriously the need to protect human rights in the region, what is maybe one more thing? You mentioned 24/7. What are ways in which people can be engaged on these issues that you've raised, Kyle?
Yeah, I would really echo what Lisa said about making sure that you're reaching out both to candidates. We don't do that at Churches for Middle East Peace, but in your individual capacity, but also to your members of Congress now about a host of issues, 24/7 being one of them. There have likewise been congressional letters recently opposing annexation. And so if your members have signed that, to make sure that they're thanked. And if they have not, starting that conversation with them to note that this is a concern. And I would say, again, this is an issue that is probably present in many of the congregations of people that are watching it, and we know that it's a challenging issue. So really educating and doing some education with your church community about this issue so that you feel confident in your advocacy and that you can speak with some authority if you haven't had the chance to dig into these topics as much. So we offer a curriculum as well for churches, more of a 101, but I would really say that education is key so that you can feel, again, confident in your advocacy efforts.
Thank you for that, Kyle. And for those that are watching, we will be providing links to resources along with this video. So do click on those for more information. Certainly, in all these contexts, they deserve more than just a few minutes of conversation to overview. They probably need a weekend or week-long conference to delve into the context more deeply. Kyle, thank you for being with us. I'll now turn to the context of the Philippines and welcome colleagues from the International Coalition on Human Rights in the Philippines, Drew and Katrina. Drew Elizarde-Miller is the National Coordinator of the International Coalition for Human Rights in the Philippines, or ICHRP US for short, and has been part of the Global Secretariat since 2019. Along with Drew is also Katrina Abarcar. Katrina, or Kat, as she prefers to be known, is an immigration attorney and advocacy coordinator for ICHRP US. She's been an advocate for human rights in the Philippines for over 10 years. Drew and Kat, the situation in the Philippines has been dire for a long time, but has taken a particularly dark turn under the leadership of Duterte, and particularly more recently under the onset of COVID-19. Maybe Drew, can you summarize briefly the top 1 to 2 human rights concerns that ICHRP is highlighting, and also maybe how COVID-19 has exacerbated those issues?
Yeah, thanks so much, Mike. We're glad to be on today. So there's a quote from Elizarde-Miller where he says, "When I give food to the poor, they call me a saint. When I ask why the poor have no food, they call me a communist." You could say the same is true for the situation in the Philippines, and you could even say, when I give to the poor, they call me a saint. When I ask why the poor have no food, they call me a terrorist. And so one of the main concerns of ICHRP US right now, along with our partners in the Philippines, is really the stronger push from the government to squash political dissent and activism. And it's mainly through some new legislation called the Anti-Terrorism Law in the Philippines. There was already this problem in which state forces, whether the armed forces of the Philippines or the national police and defense officials in the Philippines, would call activists either just assume they're communists or tag them as terrorists. And so with that, there's a lot of arrests and killings in the country. And the new anti-terror law really makes that worse in that it opens up more way for repression, where you can call someone a terrorist, you can, without a warrant, arrest them and put them in detention for up to 24 days without a trial. And so it further opens that up. And the definition of terrorism is very vague, and it has such vague language where it really implicates things like even going to a protest or collaborating or planning or a public assembly or providing any aid to terrorism. It could immediately tag you as a terrorist yourself. And so the other thing to note is that it also implicates not just Filipinos in the Philippines, but it also even includes language condemning Filipino-American activists in the US, as well as foreign nationals. And so really you could be anywhere in the world criticizing the Duterte administration and be labeled a terrorist by the government. And so that's really one of our main concerns, and it's something that has affected people across the board in making the Philippines one of the most dangerous country for environmental and land defenders, as determined by Global Witness, and any human rights defenders, including members of the United Church of Christ who have spoken out against these issues in the country.
Yeah, just to bring that home, we've had several United Church of Christ in the Philippines clergy that have been arrested and some even killed at the hands of the administration. Can you say a bit more about how kind of COVID-19 has exacerbated these in the Philippines? Because I think even among all these, it's impacted every one of these regions, but I think in the Philippines, it's had a very concrete impact.
Yeah, so the response of the Duterte government, besides pushing through this anti-terror law during the time of COVID, has also been a militarist response to COVID, which is clearly ineffective. As we know, we cannot squash a virus through military power. And examples of that are immediately after the COVID crisis started escalating in the Philippines, Duterte's response was to form a task force, and it was made completely of military generals. And instead of setting up mass testing, he actually set up a quarantine that was enforced by military officials. and that also had checkpoints all throughout like the main metro area of the Philippines. And just ongoing, it's actually led to more police abuse against people just in the streets, whether they're going to try to collect the funds that the government said they would give in relief support, or passing their way to work. And then I think the worst development is just recent in that police are actually now going door to door to check to see if anyone's COVID-19 positive.
Wow. Can you speak briefly to how U.S. policy is helping and hindering those efforts to address human rights and protect human rights defenders in the Philippines?
Yeah. So while now simultaneous to the anti-terror law, which I mentioned, and this growing police crackdown in the Philippines, at the same time in April, there's actually a notification of a major arms sale to the Philippines. So the U.S. Gives the most aid, military aid in general, already to the Philippines out of regions in Asia Pacific. But on top of that, there's arms sales, and the arms sales that came through were worth $450 million and $1.5 billion. And so that's how much the U.S. may end up providing if the Philippine government indeed buys it. So this is also to note that besides like the police attacks, that there's also widespread bombing, especially against indigenous people. There was just 37 indigenous families displaced in the middle of the night just a week ago. And it was through helicopters and drones flying over their homes that they saw this and were able to evacuate. And this arms sale to the Philippines actually is providing those exact things. So while the government is the Philippine government will, again, label anyone as a terrorist who has political threat and is bombing indigenous communities, the U.S. is actually saying they don't have a problem with selling attack helicopters and major missiles and weapons to the Philippines that would actually be further used for these attacks against civilian communities.
I didn't think when I invited the four of you to join from three different regions of the fact that these three contexts are also the largest recipients of U.S. military aid in your respective regions. Maybe I'll turn to Kat. Kat, certainly, given that reality, and as we've noted in each context, just the ways in which the U.S. is directly involved in these situations, how do you see U.S. policy, and particularly the November elections, impacting human rights in the Philippines? And maybe what are your hopes for a change of U.S. policy in the future?
So individuals shape U.S. foreign policy, and what we would like to see is public servants and representatives who aren't afraid to condemn human rights violations in the Philippines and who will put people's genuine interests over U.S. geopolitical and economic interest in the region. And we do want to see a shift in that mindset that Drew just described, where the U.S. Is comfortable providing money to the Duterte regime because we've heard it from different offices, because they feel, the cooperation should come from them rather than China. And it is a false dichotomy narrative that is being set up there. So we want to see a shift in that. Our big hope for U.S. foreign policy is that Congress will pass the Philippine Human Rights Act, which is an act that seeks to suspend security assistance to the Philippines until human rights violations by Philippine security forces cease and the responsible state forces are held accountable. We know a lot of education does need to happen along the way. So we also feel it's very important, and we would like to see, regardless of leadership, an investigation, a hearing investigating how U.S. assistance is being used or misused by security forces in the Philippines, and even focusing on the implementation of the anti-terror law, which has just come into effect. Because as Drew mentioned, the chilling effect of the anti-terror law, the repression, is not solely limited to people in the Philippines, but its impacts can even be felt by people overseas.
Thank you for that. I know the Philippine Human Rights Act was in some ways modeled after the Berta Cáceres Act from Honduras, and that is conditioning U.S. military aid is often a point of leverage that we can use to help strengthen human rights in different countries. In addition to supporting that act, or in a way to support that act, what's maybe one or two things that you would call on people to do if they want to be more active for human rights in the Philippines?
So the work we're doing to get the Philippine Human Rights Act passed is not limited to meeting with the different offices. We are very concerned and focused on building the grassroots movement to support the Philippine Human Rights Act. And we know that election time is a time when people are more inclined to talk about politics, and we want human rights in the Philippines to be among the issues that people are talking about. So aside from voting, we hope people will get their friends, get organizations to push candidates to vocalize or even have a platform on what their position is towards human rights in the Philippines and the Philippine Human Rights Act, rather than to be silent on it.
Thank you for that. I know too often the Philippines has not gotten the attention it deserves, and certainly at this time, our partners and the coalition is calling out for greater attention, and so hopefully more and more of our advocates will take note and join you in that work. Thank you, Kat. Finally, I'm pleased to have my good colleague Rebekah Choate on this webinar. Rebekah is our colleague from Global Ministries, who serves as the Global Advocacy and Education Associate for Global Ministries of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ and the UCC. Rebekah graduated from American University with a BA in International Studies and from University College in London with an MA in Eastern European Politics. Prior to joining Global Ministries, she worked in an international cultural exchange organization and has had a lifelong passion for travel and learning about the world. Rebekah, in addition to these three countries and contexts that we've highlighted, could you tell us a bit of what other human rights issues or contexts are you and our colleagues from Global Ministries particularly focused upon at this time? And maybe what are some ways to support that work?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Mike. First, just to explain, Global Ministries is a common missional ministry of the UCC and the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. So we work together as two denominations to do global work. We have hundreds of partners in about 80 different countries. And we are engaged in all three of these countries. We have partners in all three. And we are working on all kinds of different issues. Our partners are doing a variety of different things in their contexts. The big concern right now, of course, is COVID-19. We've seen around the world that it's the most vulnerable and those on the margins that are affected the most. That goes in all the countries where we see our partners, they're trying to help, and it's difficult right now, of course. So that's one of our biggest concerns. After this current situation, and on top of this current situation, there's all these other intersecting things that are going along. So of course, as we've talked about this webinar, we're interested in peace with justice, not just in the Philippines, Colombia, and Israel, Palestine, but also in Syria, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and on the Korean Peninsula. Those are kind of our main focuses of our Peace with Justice work, but of course there are other conflicts globally that our partners are working on as well. And just to mention really quickly, with Colombia, the UCC has a Colombia partnership of grassroots local church activists. If you're interested in that, you can email me. My email will be up on the web page. And then in Israel, Palestine, we have the UCC Palestine Israel Network, the PIN network, and the Disciples have a PIN network as well. If you're interested in that, you can also email me about it. Those are some grassroots ways that you as a local church member can get involved in those particular two countries where working on getting some Philippines groups going, but some of our conferences have close partnerships with the United Church of Christ in the Philippines in particular, as well as the National Council of Churches in the Philippines. So those, just to briefly mention, since we're talking about those contexts. As along with peace with justice, another major area of concern for us right now is economic sanctions, particularly the broad sweeping economic sanctions we've seen leveled against countries like Iran, Venezuela, Syria, North Korea, and Cuba. So all of our partners in the regions and in these particular countries have been heavily impacted by sanctions. And in these cases, the local population has been heavily affected by this. It's not targeted sanctions against specific individuals like the case has been with Russia. These are broad, sweeping sanctions that are affecting everyday people, ordinary people, everyday life. We saw at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, Iran was having a difficult time getting medical supplies for their folks because of the economic sanctions imposed by the US government. Some of these are broad-based, like the Korea sanctions are more of a global effort, but some of these are specific to the US, like Venezuela. The US has been targeting Venezuela more recently under the Trump administration with economic sanctions that have devastated their already poor economic situation. So those, and Congress just passed the Caesar Act, which increased sanctions on Syria, and that will impact our partners' ability to deliver humanitarian aid. A lot of these effects come from the fact that banks are not willing to take on a lot of the risks because of some of the laws that we've passed saying that you cannot provide material aid and support to terrorists. And banks are not willing to take on risks of supporting any kind of groups in these targeted countries because they might possibly, who knows, they can't do the testing and the tracing of being, you know, terrorist organizations or deemed terrorist organizations, right? So that's been the big impact that our partners have seen right now. And it's affecting ordinary people and the lack of humanitarian aid delivery. So that's a big one that US policy is, you know, we can really affect. And then of course, some of the other areas of concern is climate change that I think was a concern here. It's a concern with a lot of our partners, particularly in communities that are affected by climate change, but didn't contribute, like our partners in the Pacific Islands. These islands are disappearing because of sea level rise. Their aquifers have become salinated from salt water, and they don't have clean drinking water. And you know, these Pacific Islands are tiny. They have not contributed to the carbon emissions or the other greenhouse gases that have been emitted, but they're the ones feeling the effects of it. We also had some concern with the refugees and migration, of course. It's a big global concern right now. There's a very large number of people on the move. And of course, our whole human history has been people on the move and people moving. It's become a problem in more recent years because of our own barriers that we've put up. So we have partners working directly with refugee populations. We have partners working on the US-Mexico border, on both sides, serving folks who have been forced to remain in Mexico while their asylum cases are pending, folks who have been put in detention on the US side, as well as folks who have been deported back to Mexico, as well as Syrian refugees, of course, in Lebanon, in Jordan. Part of migration is migrant workers. So our partners in South Asia are concerned about the plight of migrant workers, as well as trafficking, human trafficking, which most of the time go hand in hand. People are promised a job in another country, and that job ends up not being what they were promised, or they are, you know, locked up and have their passports taken away from them so they can't leave. In Southern Asia in particular, those two, migrant workers and human trafficking, go hand in hand. But of course, these are all global issues as well.
That's all?
It.
Well, that is a lot.
It's a lot of things that we've got going on. Our partners are doing a lot of work. And again, each country, each context, each partner works a little bit differently. So it's our area executives have a lot on their plate right now, just with COVID, never mind everything else that our partners are concerned of right now. And I think one of the important things to emphasize is that Global Ministries really values partnership and really values the mutuality of our partnership. So it's not us handing money to a partner saying, you must do this with this money. It's our asking our partners, what do they need from us? How can we best serve with them and help them serve folks in their countries, in their contexts? So it's a back and forth. And actually that was lovely. It was highlighted in a most lovely way after the protests we've started having here after the killing of George Floyd. Quite a number of our partners responded and sent us letters and messages of solidarity. And those are on our website. It's been an amazing show of support. Usually it's the ones we're writing the letters, and it's really nice to have the tangible aspect of solidarity back with us.
Thank you, Becca. Becca's list of the many issues reminds me of how much we try to do together, and how much we, as the DC Office for Justice and Local Church Ministries, and as Global Ministries, and particularly Becca's partnership in advocacy, how much we try to cover even as a limited staff, and how critical our partnership is together, and how critical our partners are, both in terms of our advocacy here on the Hill that you, Lisa, Kyle, Drew, and Kat all represent, as well as the partnerships that Global Ministries maintains around the world are in that work. Sorry, this was not maybe so much of an uplifting webinar given the situations that are happening around the world, but hopefully it's inspiring to all of us to keep doing the work, and to keep human rights at the center of our advocacy, and at the center of possibly what motivates us to be more engaged in the elections this coming fall. So thank you all for being here and for taking time out of your days to help share these contexts with our advocates. And Jesse, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Mike. And like he said, we're so grateful to all of you for taking the time to record this webinar. Thank you also to those watching this video in the Our Faith, Our Vote Issue Education video series. I hope you will use this information to inform your participation in the election season, and that you'll share what you have learned with those in your congregation and in your communities. You can find this video and other resources on our website at ourfaithourvote.org.